Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place where I get to spoon feed you guys the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. Now, if you are hearing this right now, then you are not currently a Journal Feed subscriber and so will not be receiving the full Journal Feed podcast. If you would like to get full access to both the podcast and the blog, then you'll have to become a member. All the details for that are at journalfeed.org. And remember, we never want money to be a barrier to better patient care. So if you're having any trouble affording a subscription, just get in touch. We'll help you out. Now, this is the audio version of the past week summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors, Jason Lesnick, Aaron Lacey, Samuel Rouleau, Alexander Turner, Ketan Patel, Caitlin Nicholson, and of course, Clay Smith. Okay, let's skip straight to the third article. Title: Association of Electrocardiographic Patterns After Successful Resuscitation of Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest with Significant Coronary Lesions and Mortality, a Predefined Angiography After Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest Without ST Segment Elevation, TOMAHAWK Trial. Oof, long title. Out of the Journal of Critical Care Medicine. Now, does everyone remember the TOMAHAWK trial? The TOMAHAWK trial was a very important trial. It showed us that we don't necessarily need to bring patients to the cath lab after ROSC from an OHCA if they do not have a STEMI. Instead, they can get a delayed PCI to check out those coronaries later because they did after all arrest and it could have been a cardiac cause. But if you didn't have a STEMI at the time, then you don't necessarily need to go to PCI right away. However, there's a lot of other things that you can see on an ECG, and some of them might mean also that you have coronary occlusions. So what if you got an ECG after ROSC, OHCA, and you had ECG findings, but they weren't a STEMI? Were any of those other ECG findings significant enough that it warrants getting a PCI right away? So they have 412 patients without STEMI on their post-ROSC ECG, and 40% of them had some kind of coronary lesion. So they were able to break down the numbers a little bit, although the numbers start to get pretty small, and seeing if any of the ECG findings that they could see were significant enough that it would warrant doing PCI right away. And the answer was no, not from all the things that they looked at anyways. So T-wave inversions, ST depressions in two or more contiguous leads, these did not predict the presence of a coronary lesion. But since I learned that 50% of plaques that rupture are extraluminal plaques, meaning that they don't cause any narrowing on angiogram, well, I guess it makes me wonder if we could do more for some of these patients. Sure, their arteries are open, but if the plaque was big enough or high risk enough, would it be worth it to cover it with a stent anyways? There has been some recent data that shows that if you have high enough risk plaques, then it might be worth stenting, but this is long-term data, long-term outcomes like 2-3 years out. However, with these extraluminal plaques, is there anything that we can do about these? Is detecting them at all useful? You kind of need to put in a catheter and then do an ultrasound to see some of these. So it's some pretty significant stuff that's not easy to do, and probably more complications than a typical angiogram. It just knowing about these, though, makes me think. Anyways, from this cohort, while none of the things that they found were predictive of coronary lesions, if you did have ECG abnormalities, left bundle branch block, AFib, then you were at higher risk of mortality down the line. So pretty much if you get ROSC and there is at least something wrong with your heart, then you're more likely to die in the next 30 days, which is probably fair. You're probably just less healthy. What I would be interested to see is a reanalysis of this paper with interpretation of ECGs, keeping in mind the OMI mindset. I would read that. And although it's funny that they even kind of mentioned OMIs in this article, but since it was written by a cardiologist, they avoid the term OMI. It's probably too ER for them, so they're kind of in denial. Regardless, if your patient is post-ROSC and they have a STEMI, they should go for PCI right away. If they don't have a STEMI, then they should go for PCI soon-ish. Cardiology will figure that out. If they have an OMI, then either way, no matter what patient you have, you should probably be talking to your cardiologists. It is interesting to know, though, that patients with pretty much any abnormality on their ECG at post-ROSC are probably at higher risk of mortality. In a spoonful, outside of having a STEMI, it's not clear which ECG patterns warrant urgent PCI post-ROSC. This trial shows that patients with ECG findings had a higher mortality risk, but none of them were predictive of a positive angiogram. And then we have the fourth article titled "The Value of MRI in Transient Ischemic Attack/Minor Stroke Following a Negative CT for Predicting Subsequent Strokes," out of the Canadian Journal of Emergency Medicine. So TIA risk scores, while they have not been shown to be particularly useful, there are certainly a couple of them, and they have been validated. The Canadian TIA score is something that we've covered on this podcast before, and is a relevant TIA score that you can use. But pretty much by definition, if you have a TIA, you probably have no abnormalities on your CT scan, or at least no acute ones. And there are many minor strokes, which we also do not find anything on the CT. But does that mean that there's actually nothing there? If we look a little bit closer, if we look with an MRI, could we find something? And then if we do find something, is that going to be prognostic of what's going to happen in these patients in the future? And this study evaluated just that. They wanted to look at the predictive value of MRI in TIAs and minor strokes in patients who had negative CT scans. They correlated this with the Canadian TIA risk score and validated that indeed you're at higher risk if you have a higher risk according to the risk score compared to patients at lower risk, judging by whether or not you had positive findings on your MRI. So they found a lot of positive findings on these MRIs. 30%, 31.5 technically, but about 1/3 of patients had positive findings on MRI after a negative CT scan. And so if you had positive findings on your MRI, then you were at greater risk of a stroke within 90 days. And thus, if you incorporate this with the Canadian TIA risk score, you can get some okay predictive values. Although a low-risk patient still at 10% risk, I'd say that's pretty high to me. Thus, getting an MRI enhances stroke risk stratifications. And this is particularly probably useful in the medium risk group. Perhaps neurologists will want more MRIs now, but that's not something we necessarily need to do in the emergency department. This can be done by a rapid access TIA clinic or just by follow-up with the neurologist. As long as it's done relatively soon, I think it could help with risk stratification of patients. Though as MRI becomes increasingly easy to get, maybe this is going to be something that's done more often in the emergency department as well, but let's just leave it to the neurologists for now. In a spoonful, getting an MRI in patients with a recent diagnosis of TIA or minor stroke, even when they had a normal CT, you often find signs of ischemia. This could be important for risk stratification, but not necessarily in the emergency department. Okay, that's all the articles from this week. Let's do a quick wrap up of everything we talked about. Then from the third article, post-ROSC ECGs without ST elevation STEMIs remain a bit of a mystery as to exactly what to do with them. In this trial, which supports previous evidence, though this was just a reanalysis of the TOMAHAWK trial, if you do not have a STEMI, you do not need to go for PCI right away. However, if you do have findings on your ECG, then you are at a higher risk of mortality over the next 30 days. From the fourth article, up and above risk tools, MRI may play an important role in risk stratifying patients with TIAs and minor strokes. Again, if you are hearing this right now, then you are not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles from this past week. Let me tell you what they were about. We did a review of intussusception. We covered another trial, which looks at ringers versus normal saline, and then we dug into when is the best time to start antivirals for the flu. Links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org, or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal here is for you to read less, learn more, and save lives one spoonful at a time. Thank you.